Hey, welcome everybody to Catholic in America. Today we're going to be talking about art and how a Catholic should relate to art. Are there limits in terms of what art we can and can't consume, and how do we decide what we allow in? How do we process those things with wisdom and discernments?
So if you want to know if you're allowed to watch Game of Thrones, stick around for this episode.
So I'm curious, maybe as a starting point for conversation, tell me a little bit about maybe your parents and what they allowed you guys to consume. I'm assuming maybe you guys grew up in different faith scenarios. Do your parents have rules around what kind of art, music, movies you could...
So many rules. So many rules. I think it would probably be better to say like what were we allowed to consume instead of like what we weren't allowed, because we were converts. So we converted at a pretty young age, but we had pretty when I was at a pretty young age. But definitely there was a lot of the trash that was out there was not allowed in the house. As far as I remember, my older brothers and the music that they liked to listen to, it was always this tension. Yeah. One brother liked rap, one brother liked rock and roll music, things like Guns N' Roses and stuff like that. So there was always kind of this area of tension there. And then as far as the content that we were able to consume, there was like not much music that, and again, I don't think there was a rule that you couldn't listen to music, but there was not much music that was kind of in the house. And then a lot of times, like there was always kind of a suspicion towards any TV shows. The Simpsons was verboten. I remember, I'm old enough to remember the first season.
I remember the first
season.
I remember watching the first episode of The Simpsons.
We watched it as a family. I remember us watching the
we never
Simpsons.
watched anything after the first episode.
Absolutely. It was the exact same thing that happened with... There was
not until college.
It might have been early on. There was an early on episode of The Simpsons where Spinal Tap was on, and that's funny to me now as an adult because I know what Spinal Tap was, but as a kid I didn't know anything about it. And they had like a Satan metal concert where they had like a inflatable Satan that they were supposed to salute or something, and it was very like my parents were like, we're never gonna watch this again. Wow. That became the gold standard for evil television. So anyway, so anything with any sort of sex scenes, any sort of profanity was generally not allowed. Violence was usually okay though.
It's always interesting how we draw that line. Yeah. What about you, Father?
We were allowed to consume Christian music.
Okay.
I don't really remember as actually nothing with vulgarity. So my mom would never allow us to have anything with vulgarity. If we had vulgarity, we got severely punished. I remember TV shows. We could watch anything which was on TV generally. But if my mom found out about, I think that I got grounded for a month for sneaking and watching Saved by the Bell.
Wow.
Whoa. Yes. We watched Saved by the Bell. We were all about that life.
We could watch like, what was it, Full House, and what was the one after Full House with Steve Urkel?
Family Matters.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. But anything which showed rebellious teens and things like that was definitely verboten, forbidden in my house.
What about Steve Urkel when he became Stefan Urkel?
I don't know. I remember that.
He all of a sudden was very rebellious. Were you allowed to watch it then?
I don't think my mom was really watching it at that point.
Or Fresh Prince of Bel-Air?
No, we were not allowed to watch Fresh Prince.
Yeah, that was probably off the list for us too.
We weren't allowed to watch Saved by the Bell. I remember that my mom and my dad, they edited, it was mostly my mom, but Saturday morning cartoons. I remember there was times where my mom would go through and we were not allowed to watch certain things. Anything that usually had witchcraft or witches or anything like that, we were not allowed to consume that as kids.
So... there wasn't, there wasn't a lot of Christian TV. So I wasn't subjected to a lot of Christian television or Catholic television.
You don't remember
or something.
Great Adventures from the Bible?
Maybe. I don't know.
Gosh, yeah.
I mean, VeggieTales came out after my time. My little sister watched it.
Was that even on TV, VeggieTales?
That was I guess it was more like a DVD or VHS thing. That was more my little sister's time. We kind of thought that was funny too. But so most things were probably okay until proven otherwise, if that makes sense. If there was something that was intrinsically on the bad list, like Married with Children, then that was just on the bad list. But
Roseanne Barr, I remember. That was definitely a no-no.
So I'm hearing you say it was more entertainment value than formative. Did your parents have a vision for how the art, whether it's books, movies, TV, music, whatever, was there a positive in their eyes for being formed through art, or when did y'all develop maybe an understanding in your lives that art could and maybe even should be formative.
Yeah, I think there was a general sense of reading, reading, works of literature. Reading was always encouraged in our household. And probably kind of, we got into art maybe sort of like kind of backed into it through becoming Catholic. And all of a sudden art, the great works of art, most of which, in the Western world are religious. So we were exposed to a lot of those things kind of through that sense for their religious value. So I do feel like I remember this just great book, and it's one of those things that sticks with you. That we got this, and it's probably pretty rare in our household too, which is why it sticks with me. We had this coffee table book called Jesus, the Son of Man, I believe, and it was works by Karl Bloch of the life of Jesus. And there's still some of my favorite paintings to this day. He has this kind of like hyper-realistic, beautiful oil paintings that he would do of the life of Jesus. Some of them were pencil sketches as well. But I remember that kind of, someone gave it to us as kind of like, here's this, this Jesus book, but it was, the art in it too really spoke to me, and continues to speak to me as well. His Agony in the Garden still might be my favorite. It's the one where the angel's consoling him, and you've probably seen it before, and but he's got several other famous ones that you would know his work. But that was almost kind of accidental or kind of ancillary to our religious experience.
Yeah. What about for y'all?
For in regards to,
did your parents have a vision for art not just as entertainment, but actually something that could and maybe even should be formative?
I don't recall it being ever intentional, and it was never something which was intentionally done. Definitely, I'd say that I grew up in a kind of a protected environment in terms of making sure that Christian values, Christian ideal. So I was homeschooled, and originally my mom pulled us out of actually Catholic school when I was in the 5th grade. And then from 5th grade onward, my mom homeschooled us, which for me would generally was being dropped off the library, and my mom told me the angels will teach you, and so. But she picked me up in the afternoon.
That's a good education right there.
It was interesting. It was
that's a Goodwill Hunting education.
Actually, very similar in many regards. But
could have gotten that education for $3.50.
So my mom would bring us to mass in the morning, and then she would teach my younger siblings, but she would pretty much drop me off the library. But she had bought a curriculum which was kind of approved by the church, and which was Catholic, which was Seton Home School, Seton Home Study. And so basically that was my book list for reading and literature, and then also the stuff that I'd grab out of the library. So, and I was a voracious reader because we didn't have a lot of TV or video games growing up, so I would go through books. And actually what was interesting, my mom never really looked at the books I was reading, but I never really got into anything which was bad. I'd like chew through probably about 15 books a week.
Oh, wow.
Because I was just a voracious reader. Yeah. So I would say that in terms of the art, it wasn't really a big question in my heart. There was no philosophy or anything like that. It was more protected, make sure that there was no negative influences that were coming in. So I remember that been, I think this would have been like my late teens, early 20s. I think that my, like the Harry Potter books came out and things like that. That was obviously a big cultural thing. So like my mom was like, no, none of my younger siblings could read Harry Potter. But I read them at the time, but I was obviously older.
Do y'all remember encountering a piece of art, again, in whatever form, movie, music, book, where for the first time, like you realized something deeper was going on here? It struck you not just like that was entertaining or something fun to talk about or experience, but you engaged in a deeper level with it. Do you remember any pieces of art like that?
Yeah, I would go back to Karl Bloch's paintings as well. But I think as a piece of music, I remember the first time consciously hearing the Moonlight Sonata by Beethoven. And I eventually, as I got older, I got more into music and but wasn't really like raised like, all right, we're going to sit down and listen to this. It's possible, and I might be. My parents are watching this, like, well, what are you talking about? We took you to symphonies every day when you were 5 or something. I apologize. I don't remember that, but that I remember just being moved by this, like just being so struck by this piece of music that's just chords, being played by as one piano that could just kind of take you on this journey. And to me, it spoke to those sorts of things that I would often get from books, because to me, books were always those things that could do that, where you had this. I remember the first time I read The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, where my kind of like sense of wonder and awe and like longing that C.S. Lewis and other people would talk about really was elicited by this. And immediately for me, like, oh man, what if I could create something like that? What if I could write a book that elicited that sort of feeling? So I remember the Moonlight Sonata being one of those first pieces of music that kind of touched on what books had already started to do for me as far as awakening this desire or this longing or this wonder. I think would be maybe the good word for it.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that for me, going back to it was that was obviously I can see now. It was built into the curriculum that I was using, which was Seton. So like we, in terms of literature, I was reading great books. In terms of even the exposure of history was through the lens of I remember Warren Carroll was the major historian. So like it was always a thing which I didn't really even think about. But I was exposed to literature, exposed to art. I remember probably the first time that it became really apparent to me was when I think I was exposed to Michelangelo when I was probably about 10, 11 years old, and I loved Michelangelo.
Yeah.
Actually, I read a biography on Michelangelo, really dove into Michelangelo's life, and then like studied his art when I was a young teen. And then went to Rome as a tour guide. Obviously, I hunted down every Michelangelo I could find in the city. But I think it was Michelangelo, but I was much more always interested in the personalities behind the art and understanding the personalities behind the art. So it's the same thing like when I saw Bernini and Bernini's art as a young man, I then studied Bernini and looked at his, trying to understand like what was the type of person who created these types of things. So I was actually very interested in the psychology of the artist, which I thought was a way to understand the art. I think you had to understand the artist. And so I always found that fascinating. So I think that was, for me, it was probably Michelangelo, probably when I was a young teen.
Oh. Was Bernini the one who has that one piazza in Rome that he made the fountain and it's looking on a building that was made by one of his kind of like chief rivals? And the angel that's looking towards that building is like shield.
I'm not sure if that's Bernini, but that sounds like Bernini.
It's so good.
Because Bernini had one of the most, next to Michelangelo, a wicked sense of humor.
Just vindictive kind of thing, man.
Well, it's like The Last Judgment with Michelangelo put the cardinal who criticized his work down in hell, with the serpent eating his genitalia. So
yeah, that's art is incredible. So yeah.
So speaking of kind of this mixture of the profane and the beautiful, I'm interested in how there's a puritanical strain in Christianity in America that sometimes equates art must be pure, it must be clean, it must be family friendly. But then even if we look at Scripture, which is given to us as inspired word of God, it's also, even for non-believers, regarded as an incredible work of art. And we look at the contents of that art, there is absolutely like profane, vulgar, difficult things represented, sometimes very, very vividly within Scripture.
Sex, violence, rock and roll. I mean, if you wanted to...
I've missed those chapters, but...
Well, you had the rock that fell on, what's his name? On the... What was his name's head?
That one, yes.
Gideon's son.
So
Abimelech.
Clearly there's got to be... What was it?
Abimelech.
Maybe that'll be my next child.
Rock fell and rolled off.
So clearly within Scripture, which is given to us by the Lord, there's room for more than just what's GPG. But I think a lot of people wonder, how do we navigate that as we look to what art we should be consuming for ourselves as adults, or even talking about for parents out there as they're looking at their kids. So I don't know, do y'all have any thoughts on how to navigate where are some of these lines? How do we approach art? Are we only looking for the Berninis and the Moonlight Sonatas, and that's all as Catholics we should be exposing ourselves to?
I think it's a great question. So, and it's something that the church doesn't have like a strict line necessarily. Obviously, there's certain aspects where we get into things that are the exploitation of the human person, the degradation of the human person for its own sake. Obviously, if you're reading something like a book or a novel that involves horrific acts that do happen or are inflicted upon people, you would have to see that, okay, is this done still with a certain reverence towards the person? Because you read something that's going to be about, the exploitation of workers or something. Like, there's a way to do that is basically, even more exploitative in the way it's describing it, or in a way that's recognizing that that's an evil. We need to be real about it, maybe even raw about it in a way that's uncomfortable, but that can hopefully lead us towards pondering, or at least beginning to consider, maybe even seeing what redemption looks like. So it's interesting that the church doesn't have a lot of strict lines on that. Again, pornography would be something that, like, no, it's not artistic, because it's ordered towards itself. It's ordered towards sexual exploitation and sexual excitement for its own sake.
But that's also an interesting point, though. You bring that up because that was going back to Michelangelo in the Last Judgment in the Sistine Chapel. You'll have that where you had the cardinal who came in and looked at that piece of art after Michelangelo had spent, I believe, 3 years painting it, as well as the rest of the chapel. And he looks upon he's with there, I believe it was Julius II, and it was his basically the cardinal who was his master of ceremonies, comes in, looks at the Last Judgment, and basically says, this is a piece which should be better regulated to a whorehouse.
Wow.
Because of all the nudes, because Michelangelo painted all those in the nudes, and basically accused Michelangelo and accused him of painting pornography on the wall of the Pope's, and that's where that's where he was like, this needs to be torn down, and the Pope at the time just looked at it and said nothing, and he said, we'll address this later. And that's when Michelangelo comes in the middle of the night and scrapes off the face of Minos and paints on the face of the cardinal onto Minos down in hell, and does his little his rip on him. But it was over exactly that, of like, what is appropriate for a house of God, and what is appropriate art versus what is pornographic, because that's the whole point of, like, what is the intent behind the art. And that's where, like, different people who view art, there is a subjective quality to art in how we subjectively look at a thing, but then the question becomes, what is the intent and motive behind it? Because, like, you could, like, this cardinal right here made the argument that this was not pornographic, because it was there was all the original paintings that they were bodies done in the nude. From Michelangelo's perspective, this was not pornographic, and in that case, the Pope actually agreed with Michelangelo, because it was later popes who later said that they painted the loincloths on most of the figures in the Sistine Chapel, but originally the Pope disagreed. So there is this tension, this interesting tension that you'll find in the observation of art, and then obviously the consumption of art. And then does this bring, I think from my perspective, I'd say, does this bring glory to God, and is the art lifting up of the works of human hands to God? And is this something which elevates, or is the intention of the work to pull and to drag down?
Well, it's interesting too, because John Paul II during the restoration of the Sistine Chapel, which happened, I believe, in the 80s, and the reason why you can't photograph in the Sistine Chapel, by the way, is because the Japanese film company that paid for the restoration, they have total rights to those pictures. But anyway, that's why they say no photo if you're ever in there. Like, no photo, the Italian guards will really get on if you try to take pictures while you're in the Sistine Chapel. But when having those removed, he talked about it as a shrine of or a chapel of the theology of the body. That's what John Paul II talked about, and, like, as far as the glory of the body, what that looks like, but also too the degradation of the body, because in a sense, when you see hell, you see the contrast between heaven and hell, and especially in the Last Judgment there. But then you see the creation of Adam and Eve, all those things. So I like the point that it could say, you can have, and this would be different when you get into film, and so maybe we can set aside film for this. When we're talking about painting. In painting, you can have nudes that aren't pornographic, and you can have pornography that's not necessarily nude, if that makes sense. You know, that, like, so a lot of it has to do with how the body and the person, sex, all those things are being used or abused or exploited, or if it's, what the purpose of it is. I think that probably gets shifted a little bit when we get into actual photography, because it then becomes very, very difficult within the photographic, capturing of somebody who's naked to not make that somehow linked to a pornographic kind of expression. Does that make sense? And maybe there's people who might have a different opinion there, but I feel that it's you can have a painting of a nude that's not pornographic, but it becomes very hard to have a picture of a nude that's not at least adjacent to pornography, if not pornography itself, or pornograph, or kind of ancillary, or like in the vestibule of pornography. Yeah. So would need to be rejected then.
Yeah. So you brought up the point that even with different mediums of art, something there is a difference between looking at a painting and watching a movie. Like you're getting
Yes.
connected to not just an image of a person, but that person's story. And something about the medium of film can draw our emotions, I think, in more intense ways, by the music, by the characterization, etc. So yeah, maybe as you're looking at films, what are some things that you might need to be careful about when you're approaching a film as opposed to other forms of art?
Yeah, I think that there is a, and again, you know, not just draw a line at, well, nudity equals bad or equals evil, because I believe there are films that do have some aspect of the human body, the human person, and the human form being shown that aren't necessarily exploitative in the way that they're doing that. It becomes hard though because that can be extracted from the rest of the film. If you're trying to build a whole story and there's a scene that makes sense within the story of, you know, so again, there's a possibility there, but I think that it becomes nearly impossible, particularly in our what John Paul II would call our porno vision world, which is so impacted and affected by our fallen gaze or the way that we look upon the other person, especially look upon the other person's bodies, that not having any sort of reverence or dignity for that makes it really hard to justify that being shown. So, you know, I mean, if a sex scene is happening and there's naked bodies kind of within that context, it's very difficult to be like, oh yeah, this is necessary for the plot, or this is necessary for the artistic expression of this. So.
Yeah, I mean, going back to John Paul, he has a quote which is that, from the Theology of the Body, which is that the problem with pornography is not that it shows too much, but that it shows too little. So it objectifies, it reduces a person merely to their physicality, to their material essence. So, and it doesn't take into account the invisible realities, which is the emotions as well as the thought, the history, the story. And that's what I say is the most damning and demonic thing about pornography, is that it strips people of actually their stories. And that's why the person who is viewing them creates an alternative reality for them, which is the phantasm of their own mind. And so it's this reduction, stripping away a person's stories, stripping away their history, stripping away their emotions, which is found in pornography. I think that part of it is also, though, to me, what's more dangerous in film is the seductive and the teaching ability, because it's a fantastic medium for teaching, because it engages, it hyperstimulates the right side of the brain, right, and it also decreases in terms of the left side of the brain, the analytical side. It decreases. I mean, there have been tons of studies on, and this is one of the reasons why, like, in terms of brainwashing, it's a great brainwashing tool. But at the same time, it's also a great teaching tool, because you can open people up to a full spectrum of stimuli, which helps people to understand something. And so that's why, like, it is good, like, in the sense of, like, it's a great teaching tool. But the question is, what is being taught? So to me, it's more the ideas. It's not so much whether there's violence or whether there's a nudity, because sometimes, like, the violence is acceptable. The question is a question of what is prudent. And for a person who's an adult to prudently consume something that's different than a teenager, or versus obviously an innocent, a child. And then you have obviously little kids. Like, there's a question of prudence. So it's not just a question of black and white justice. Can I or can I not? Right? There's a certain point where there are certain things which are objective, which we should never consume. Right? But then there's also this question of prudence, and that's why, to the degree that a person is mature, and then the question is this, like, why am I consuming this, and is this prudent for me to consume? Like, so can I? Maybe I can, but should I? Is this prudent? But there are some times, like, there's certain things in terms of, especially like movies, there's a point that's being made, and so, like, there might be a case where you're not looking at something which is pornographic, but you're looking at something which is in fact art, or something that's just not just violence for violence sake. I mean, you can look at, like, for instance, Braveheart. Braveheart is one of the most violent movies ever made. The Passion of the Christ, one of the most violent movies. I mean, all to give Mel Gibson this, he does violence par excellence. And so, like, that's where you, like, but the whole point of, like, the Passion of the Christ being as violent as it is, because it's depicting reality. It's trying to take away this false sense of this Puritan understanding that, okay, well, Jesus died on the cross. Like, no, Jesus frigging died on the cross in a horrific way. And so, like, showing the brutality of that through that medium, I think, was obviously appropriate. The question is like, are we glorifying violence for the sake of violence? Are we glorifying sex for the sake of sex? Are we doing this? And that's where I'm saying that's where there is an objective part of both art and filmmaking. Is what is the intent of the persons who are creating this? What is the ideas that are present in the medium? Because the ideas, those things are more dangerous to me than whether or not that it's something as violent or that. Like, where is this ending? Where is this leading me to? Is this leading me to a greater appreciation of God and of the transcendent, the holy? And that's where God teaches us, like in the scriptures. That's why when people sanitize the scriptures, right? Like, I read as a kid the scriptures because every time I got in trouble, my mom made me read the Bible. And so I found all the stories of blood, guts, and gore. And there's lots of them. And that's why when people try to sanitize the scriptures, I'm just like, that's not what the Bible actually says. The Bible is very unsanitary because human beings are not always sanitary. So there's this notion of like, what is the point? Like, God teaches us through the negative lens and through the via negativa of what not to do. So you have like stories of Tamar and Jacob. You have stories of the Benjaminites who basically plundered this whole war of the Benjaminites, where the women of Benjamin, the end of Judges, basically all, to a certain extent, get raped. And so like, you have the story of Tamar and, I think it's Tamar, David's daughter with his son, Amnon. So you have these horrible stories, but the reason why they're there is for human beings to learn from these stories. The difference, obviously, with the medium of the scriptures is that it doesn't engage the brain in the same way that the visual mediums do. And obviously, it doesn't hyper-stimulate the brain the way that film does. But you can't just throw a film out, but there's a way in which you can still say, okay, what's going on? But I can tell you this, if you meditate and contemplate the scriptures, some of those stories can get pretty dark and pretty demented pretty quick.
Well, I think an example of this would be, you mentioned Braveheart as a film that I do think, it does have a lot of violence. Actually, does have some nudity and sex scenes as well. But I wouldn't consider it a pornographic film. I always contrasted that with a movie because I remember seeing this movie came out when I was in college, was 300. You guys might remember. I remember telling someone, that movie's pornographic. And they thought I meant like one of the sex scenes. I don't even remember if there was sex scenes in that movie. It's possible. But I meant more the treatment of the human body became this exploited reality. Even in kind of like the battles, the violence, it was this highly stylized sort of thing. Like, it was, in a sense, it was kind of this, let's just exploit and use this reality of the human flesh for the sake of this visual spectacle. So I felt like through the violence in that kind of had more of that tinge of pornography than other movies that maybe had a greater reverence, if I can put it that way, in the intentionality behind the people that were making it.
Yeah, I'm thinking of the most recent Les Mis that came out with Hugh Jackman, and I'm forgetting the names of the characters, but Anne Hathaway's character, Fantine, has to end up resorting to prostitution in order to stay alive and have money for her daughter. Am I remembering the story right? And it's not played, the moment of this actually happening is not played with any sort of brightness or levity or seductive qualities or anything. It's almost like, we are drawn down into the horror of the situation. She is being exploited, but we are not drawn to the seductive characteristics of sex, but rather her degradation that she's experiencing. Yeah. So there is a way within art that we can be drawn down. Like you said, that depiction also depicts hell. No, especially I think as priests, maybe would you all have any examples of arts, film, music, books that you've encountered even recently that you felt like are actually good, healthy looks at aspects of the darkness that humans experience on this side of the fall?
Good at looking at the darkness on this side of the fall? One film which I liked, which I thought was, I'm not sure exactly what his intent is, because I know who the director is, and it's Ridley Scott, who I believe is I'm not sure if he's agnostic atheist, but he has a lot of things. But he goes into a lot of themes of what does it mean to be human, and so he has a lot of these anthropological questions, especially through the lens of technology and human. What does it mean to be human? What does it mean? What is technology, and the play between technology and how these things are both good but also damning to a certain extent. And so, like, I think that the most recent Blade Runner movie,
2049.
Yeah, 2049. I thought I watched it, and there was definitely some scenes in it which were provocative and which were, I mean, seemingly be semi-pornographic. But when I was watching the film, and I like I said, with Scott's kind of his worldview and things like that, he was asking questions of what is the purpose of technology? What does it mean to be human? And there was this very interesting scene in that particular film where you had basically a human prostitute who's brought in to provide flesh for the AI or the robot girlfriend of the main figure. And so you have this very interesting scene, which is a love scene in that film, but it was, I would say that it was definitely erotic, but there was also the deeper question of what's going on here, and do you prefer the human, and what does it mean to be human, or do you want your fantasy this female who just tells you exactly what you want to hear, which is actually what the robot or the AI girlfriend was, and that's where like later on in the film you had this point where all of a sudden he realizes near the end of the film. Sorry, spoiler alert if you've seen not. It's been out for a couple of years now. But you have this interesting scene at the very end of the film where he's basically standing in front of this nude AI, this giant, and her name was interestingly Joy. This giant nude of Joy, but he realizes in this moment that it's all fake. He realizes in this moment like it's all fake, and like in that. So to me, I thought it was one of the more interesting analyses of both technology, pornography, the reductionistic tendencies of technology to reduce human beings just to data and numbers and to just our raw animal essence, and but also it was critical, I think, at the same time, because the end of the movie ends with the real father, which is the Harrison Ford character with his daughter in a real relationship versus this other one, which was with I forget the actor. Oh, I can see his face.
Ryan Gosling?
Yeah, Ryan Gosling, who has he himself is not human. He's a synthetic, but he also has...
Spoiler.
Yeah, but not only is his life fake, his relationships are fake, and it leads to this type of nihilism where he dies in this nihilism at the very end of the movie, versus you have the other figure of so I think that in that I found it to be a very interesting analysis. It obviously has some very mature themes in it, but looking at the darkness and looking at some of these anthropological questions that are being elicited by technology.
Yeah.
As well as the search for God, because obviously in that Christians were not necessarily displayed well in that particular film. But I thought it was an interesting film that looked into some of those darker themes, which I think that actually, regardless of Scott's point, I think that there is some crossover between those as in our Christian perspective anthropologically.
Yeah, I would say, in literature, there's an author like Flannery O'Connor is probably a great example of this. She's a writer of novels and short stories, Catholic from the South, and every one of her stories is disturbing. Every one of her stories is violent and has exploitation and sex and just the grotesque is pretty. And it's interesting how that she used that medium and can convey grace. I don't think she's never trying to be like a pious, I'm going to trick people into reading a story about Jesus. She's actually engaging with this stuff, but grace comes through, in her writing. I was thinking recently another film that I saw, and I would not recommend it, but kind of like as sort of like the shadow side of this. Robert Eggers just redid Nosferatu, and we went and watched it, and there was definitely some, like, as a depiction of a pornographic entity or spirit, it definitely was that. Not that I want to tell people, go watch that movie so you can understand how to better diagnose pornography. But as far as like an actual vampirous destruction and feeding on other people's essence and robbing them of their own their own agency and of exploiting their bodies, all those things, in a sense, it really kind of displayed the darkness very, very well. I don't know if we needed to go as dark with that as it went in order to do it.
Yeah, I think that part of it is also like unnecessary graphicness. Like there's certain things that it needs to be graphic to accurately but I think that there's a certain point also with art. Like there's blunt art, there's blunt direct art, which is not really that interesting, versus there's subtle art. So like there's a point where like things need to be graphic to a certain extent if it's necessary. but it doesn't need to be unnecessarily graphic.
Yeah.
And so I think that there's a lot of point where just for shock value and to sell things because everyone knows that sex and violence sells. So they make it unnecessarily graphic or ridiculously graphic. But there's a loss of subtlety because really it's just a money grab versus I think that in subtle art, which is better art, there's not this gratuitous graphicness. So that's the thing is at this point, I'm not really interested in the graphic.
Yeah.
Like if there's a point for the graphic to be there, but there's also a point of like, is it unnecessarily graphic? And could you have done this in an equally profound way without it being so graphic? And so I think that the problem is that we become so desensitized that the only way that you can elicit an emotional response from people nowadays is to make things graphic. But I think that just dulls our sense. It doesn't actually sharpen it.
Yeah,
and art should sharpen you. It shouldn't dull you.
Yeah, I've seen so many, as a movie buff, I see so many films that are coming out advertised for like the shock value of their scenes. You won't believe what they showed in this horror film, whatever. I'm like, no interest in that, but it's, so yeah, they have to one up every time, get more and more graphic. But one area I think about with graphic art as a parent of a son, who's very interested in weapons and soldiers and military and such. I think there's a lot of great art out there that kind of inspires the heroism and adventure of like military exploits. But then you also come across art that depicts maybe the reality of what war actually looks like and feels like. So thinking of a Saving Private Ryan, which I'm not going to show my 7-year-old son, Saving Private Ryan. Keep it out of the comment
but
sections.
One day when he's 15, you might want to show him.
Exactly,
So he's not under the illusion.
Yeah, and but then there's also, for example, a novel, Hannah Coulter by Wendell Berry, I really love. And this woman is kind of reflecting over her life. Her husband went through World War II, came back a shell of a man. No graphic depictions, but the weight is there. The weight of what he experiences communicated just through words, zero visuals. I think there's something really powerful and good about art, but we can do that well, and we can do it poorly or thoughtlessly. So I've heard from Christopher West. He's fond of this story of, two bishops walk out of a cathedral, and they're walking down the street, and they see a prostitute walk in, on the other side, go in the opposite direction. One bishop averts his eyes. The other bishop looks at her, with great clarity in his gaze, and the bishop who averted his eyes after she passes asks, Brother Bishop, why would you do that? Why wouldn't you avert your eyes? And come to find out, his brother Bishop, whose gaze was upon her, was gazing with the vision of the Father, realizing her dignity, loving her and desiring her to know the fullness of her dignity. So he asks, which of these bishops did the right thing? And the answer is both of them. For one bishop, he needed to avert his eyes. For the other, he was able to engage well with the heart of the Father with wisdom. So talking about the subjective experience of art, what advice, any practical counsel that you guys would give for people that were inundated with all of these films, different forms of art coming at us? They're trying to discern, what can I prudently engage in? Any practical advice you'd give for folks?
If you're an addict, then you shouldn't be. You don't need to have a little bit of what you're trying to go. And I'd say it, bluntly, flippantly, but recognizing that we live in a lust addicted society, and many of us are afflicted by addictions somehow connected to that in one way or another, or to violence or degradation or salaciousness or horror or negativity. So in a sense, if somebody was getting out of, they were really involved in the occult, and they're kind of coming back to faith, and they're coming to faith in Jesus, I'd say, well, it's probably not the best thing for you to be watching lots of horror movies right now. It's probably not the best thing to be watching lots of supernatural thrillers that, for someone who has no attachment to the occult, wouldn't be a problem at all, to watch that movie or to read that book or something. But so kind of recognizing where you are, and that there probably needs to be some time and some distance there before you're able to kind of dip into those things. So I think, again, there's certain scenes in certain movies that have romantic scenes, and that might be part of the story, might be beautiful. But if you're struggling very hard with a pornographic addiction, then maybe like, all right, I'm not going to watch that for now because that could lead me in a place that I don't want to go. No one's like, for us watching Braveheart is not like for any sort of skin that's shown or the marriage scene or anything like that, but for someone who's maybe struggling there, that might be something, and to use that phrase, triggering. And so knowing yourself well enough to be like, all right, I'm going to avoid that, or at least avoid that scene for the sake of my own greater freedom as I continue to make work to work in these areas. So I think that's maybe just one place where you can kind of say, all right, you have to know yourself, and you have to recognize that to the pure all things are pure. To the pure all things are pure, but a lot of us are not pure in a lot of different areas, and so there's work that needs to be done, and it's not because that is so terrible and bad and evil necessarily, but because there's work you have to do. I know some people who struggled with drug addiction and other stuff too, and they're like, there's certain music I can't listen to. Yeah. And it's not because the music doesn't cause you to take drugs, but it puts them in a frame of mind, because music is so powerful, that it puts them personally in a place where they're like, okay, I can't listen to this because it puts me back in that feeling that I'm going to go. And someone needs to recognize that. If someone's struggling in their marriage or struggling in celibacy, and they listen to a certain song, and it always gets them wistfully thinking about calling that other lady who, she understood me, like, oh, maybe you shouldn't listen to that song. Not because the song itself is evil, not because, you need to only listen to DC talk for
like
music.
DC talk.
But there's, I do too, I love DC talk, shout out to them. But there's this recognition that, for my own sake, I need to be listening to something that's going to help me to live authentically my own vocation and life of holiness too, and hopefully I get to a place where I can go back to that song and I can listen to it, not and be tempted to then betray my vows or hurt somebody, but for the sake of, and I can enjoy that nostalgia maybe and continue to move forward. So I think knowing yourself there is really key and important.
Yeah, I've seen that play out in my own life with. Got a little melancholy in my temperament, and I like melancholic art a lot of the times, but I also have a history with anxiety and depression. And if I'm in that place and I start listening to that music or watching those kinds of films or reading those kinds of books, it ain't gonna help nothing. So I've seen that play out for sure.
Yeah, I think that, jumping off what Father Michael is saying, I think that there's a question we were talking about of prudence, and it's not a question of justice, which is black and white, and you can or can't do this. It's a question of prudence. Ought you to? I think that's where recognizing where temperance plays in. It's like, am I being temperate in this? Because if your appetite, now Aristotle says that the appetite is subjective, and or at least taste and appetite are subjective, so you shouldn't really criticize that. But part of taste and appetite, going to the virtue of temperance, is that it's well proportioned. So well proportioned, which means that I can put it down and I can pick it back up. The proportions are right. Actually, I'd say even the objective qualities of art is that art should be well proportioned, where there's not a craving, where it's not inordinate, it's not bloated, right? Because that's the very opposite of temperance. So there can also be, like, in the consumption of art, do I have this unhealthy craving? And this is where, like, a person has to ask themselves, like, is this good for me?
This is binge watching. I mean, we live in a society where binge watching is now the norm. To recognize there's something inherently unchristian or unvirtuous, at least, about that practice. Not that any of us are saying, like, anytime you watch, you click on the third episode in a row that you're now evil, but it is a serious consideration to have that I think we oftentimes don't.
But in that craving, like, recognize, is there a craving? When I consume this, is this making me sharper, or is this making me duller? And so that's also one of the qualities of actual art. Art is sharp and has contrast and has proportion and has all the different objective qualities of art. And it real good art should have the same quality, it should have the effect upon the person that it makes you a sharper, makes you a better person. There's also, like, when you do that, there's certain things like, is this actually sharpening my appetites, or is this dulling my appetites? Is this making me a better person, or is this making me a more dull person? Is this inflaming my passions? Right, and that's a big thing. Like, is this just inflaming the passions and my desire to consume, or is that when I'm done with this, am I satisfied? Because that's how you kind of know, is this something which is good for me? Is like, I eat something and then I'm satisfied, versus I have to eat and eat and eat and eat and eat and eat. Like, that's not a temperate response, but it also means that whatever I'm consuming, I'm not actually having my appetite satisfied. That's why when people consume and consume and consume, and especially like forms of art, there's a certain point where like art, if it's really good art, it should leave you with a sense of lightness and not heaviness. And there's certain things like I can watch like a movie, but you watch 2 to 3 movies at a time. The question is, are you really appreciating what you're consuming? And the same thing, like you can consume one movie, but it's not like you say in a state where you're in a melancholic state, and all of a sudden you watch some dark, depressing thing. I say, don't watch The Road. Like with Viggo Mortensen, don't watch The Road when you're super depressed. Like watch it when you're in a good mental state, because it's a very dark, but it's a very good movie. It's a very dark. It's a great movie about fatherhood as he's taking his son. But I would say that the question
The
is,
book was amazing. I've never read
Pulitzer
I've seen
Prize.
the movie, but
the movie was fantastic. But it's one of the darkest movies I've ever seen in my life. But it's a great movie. But it's at the same time like, is this appropriate for me to consume right now? Like it might be in a particular time, but it's also the question is what's the effect? Because art does have an effect on persons, and that's where we have to recognize subjectively, not just what's my taste, but what's the subjective way in which this is affecting me. And there's sometimes the question is, I don't need to know.
Yeah. It's also we have limited capacity, we have limited time, and so to recognize what am I feeding my mind and heart, what am I listening to, and I tend to, let me put it in the I tend to fill up most of my time with podcasts or music or videos, or it's very easy to sit down to eat lunch and I'm going to watch something on YouTube like that. It's so easy to occupy our time and our eyes and our ears. And man, it is good to be discerning there. It's good to recognize. All right, if I'm going to watch something, I'm going to watch it with a purpose and for an end. And whether it's funny, it could be educational, it could be guy breaking the world hot dog eating record or something like that. It could be, doesn't have to necessarily be the Passion of the Christ or something. It can be something that is, but to do it because like, I want to do something that's entertaining and I can engage in that. I can listen to this music because it makes me, because I'm on the road and I love to listen to these particular singers, this country music or whatever it is. But there is something that I think being discerning, we don't live in a society where we're too discerning with this stuff. Then going the other direction, would just be where we do have the puritanical, you can't listen to anything unless it talks about Jesus all the time. And I don't think that's not, I don't think that's necessarily helpful for everybody. Some people might need to do that. It might be fruitful for them. I do think we miss out on a lot of the beauty of good art, which is going to convey God, whether it uses God's name or not.
Yeah. As we begin to wrap up here, I think one of the things I'm taking away from this conversation is the necessity for engaging both the minds and paying attention to this like heart subjective experience. So you mentioned earlier, like, what's the director, the author, the artist's intent with this? Am I aware that they're trying to communicate something? Am I thinking about what they're trying to communicate and wrestling with this? Is this true? Is this not? But also this subjective experience of where is this pulling my heart? Is it pulling me down in melancholy or pulling me towards feelings of lust or whatever it might be? Or is there a positive experience going on here too, where the Holy Spirit might even, in the midst of this secular film, might be convicting me or leading me to the fullness of truth in a way? But paying attention, rather than this consumptive mentality with art, approaching it with some intentionality and paying attention to our minds, the mind of the artist, and our heart's experience can lead us to a greater fullness of experience there. Guys, this was awesome. Thank you so much for this conversation. I'm taking a lot out of it personally, and I'm sure our listeners will too.
Guys, we want to thank you so much for checking us out here on Catholic in America, for tuning in. Thank you also for liking, sharing, and subscribing to these videos. Check us out on Patreon. We can't do this without your support, and we can't wait to see you next time.